The scramble for Africa is, I believe, one of the most poorly understood periods in history. From what I gather, most people seem to believe that the colonial powers one day sat around a map at the Berlin Conference, drawing borders around bits they wanted, and that was it. But the scramble had already begun by the time of the conference of 1884. Plus, the conference dictated that any claimant must show effective occupation of a region before it was granted to them. This meant, in some instances, there were literal races between explorers. With the exception of maybe the Zulus and Ethiopians, the Africans and their battles against colonialism are often just completely ignored. Plus, the fact that some African countries like Egypt and Ethiopia actually expanded is also often glossed over. The first European colonies in Africa were set up by the Portuguese as bases along their route to India. These included Madeira in the Atlantic, Sofala and Mozambique, Luanda in Angola, and Mombasa and Zanzibar in East Africa. This was pretty much the standard for colonialism at that time. It was far more profitable to set up factories for trade and control sea lanes rather than taking over entire regions. But late in the 16th century, the Iberian Union united Portugal with Spain, and as such, the Portuguese entered into Spain's wars against the Dutch and the English. The Dutch were quick to move into the colonial game and took Elmina from the Portuguese. They expanded in West Africa, established the Dutch slave coast, and built forts in Senegal. While in the south, in the middle of the 17th century, they founded Cape Town, an important midway point for ships sailing between the oceans. The Dutch that settled in this region became the Boers. However, the locals in South Africa that they encountered during this period were not the Zulu, they were the Khoikhoi. These are often grouped together with the San hunter-gatherers, but they were a distinct group of people. The Zulu, on the other hand, didn't enter the picture for another few decades, as they were Bantu who migrated from the north. Let's start with the Bantu. They originated probably from Cameroon, and they migrated south and east. This migration lasted potentially thousands of years, so don't think of it like a mass movement of people. It was the Bantu who established the Kingdom of Congo in Central Africa, and this kingdom, in the early 1600s, sent an ambassador to meet with the Pope in Rome. He was Emmanuel Nevunda, but after traveling via Brazil and Spain, he died just 2 days after arriving in Rome. Many of their rulers became Christian very early on and adopted European fashions. Congolese men also joined Christian religious orders. They had their own coats of arms, but their country was often torn apart by civil war. And strangely, during one of these wars in the late 1600s, a prophet emerged. This prophet was Kimpa Vita, and she had visions claiming that Jesus was in fact born in the Congo. Otherwise, in Central Africa, you had many kingdoms, like the kingdoms of Burundi and Rwanda. From very early on, these kingdoms were based on Tutsi dominance over the Hutus. In southern Africa, it was also the Bantu, specifically the Shona people, who built Great Zimbabwe in medieval times. But by the 1600s, Great Zimbabwe had fallen, and power in the region was transferred to Mutapa in Mozambique. This kingdom was eventually weakened due to infighting and Portuguese interference. So by the late 17th century, they often accepted the vassalage of the Portuguese, or even their other new neighbor, the Rozvi Empire. The Rozvi grew rich on gold and were a formidable power. Going further north along the coast, the Muslims once ruled over the important trading centers of Zanzibar and Mombasa. But soon a new power emerged in the region, Oman. Their capital of Muscat had been held by the Portuguese, but they were driven out of there in the 1600s, and the new Yarubid dynasty capitalized on their victory and chased the Portuguese and took over the east coast of Africa. Zanzibar, in particular, would become an important trading center for the lucrative Arab slave trade, something that played a very important role during the scramble for Africa centuries later. But their failures against Ethiopia meant that Ethiopia would remain an independent Christian kingdom, trapped behind Muslim lands. So many Christians believed that this was the homeland of Prester John, a fictional Christian king of great wealth who would aid the Europeans in their conquest of the Islamic empires. Going even further back, Their ruler Lalibela built huge stone churches, which bear his name in the 12th century as a sort of second Jerusalem. This whole area of East Africa had a completely different racial makeup. Within Ethiopia, they had a number of different ethnicities like the Tigrayans and the Amharans. Amharic was the language of the empire, a Semitic language. A journalist from Haiti named Benito Sylvain met Emperor Menelik II, and he hoped that he would become an honorary president of their society, advancing the cause of black people. But Menelik refused, declaring that he was in fact a Caucasian man. Then in Ethiopia, in the 1500s, they were facing a sort of migration crisis as the Oromo people from southern Ethiopia began to migrate north. Going further west still, you had the Hausa states. Then to the west of them, you had the declining Mali Empire. The desire for gold was essential for the survival of the European economies. This is because from 1457 to 1464, there was a bullion famine, and the Europeans were running out of gold and silver. So Europeans began exploring and discovered West Africa and their gold mines, and these practically saved Europe. The gold from this region was so well circulated in Europe that this is where you get the name of the old Guinea coins from. Back in West Africa, there was a powerful empire just to the east of Senegal, the Songhai Empire. But the Songhai Empire had all but collapsed by the 1600s, and their defeat didn't come at the hands of the Europeans, but Morocco. Their new sultan, Ahmad al-Mansur, launched an invasion south and crushed the Songhai. However, their rule over West Africa didn't last long. The logistics of maintaining such a large empire across the Sahara proved to be too hard, especially after plagues swept through the region. This brings me to one of the most forgotten colonizers of Africa, the Muslims of the north. After the Ottomans defeated the Mamluks, they annexed Egypt, and this in turn opened their path to taking coastal Libya, Algeria, and Tunisia. These would later become the Barbary states, which infamously would launch pirate attacks on ships passing through the Mediterranean Sea. Under his command, the pirates would launch raids as far north as Iceland, where they captured hundreds of people in the 1620s. These people, like many Europeans at that time, were then brought back to the Barbary states and sold as slaves. This slave trade probably saw close to 1 million Europeans enslaved. When Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess, married King Charles II of England in 1662, she gave Tangier to the English as part of the dowry. But the English Protestants already suspected that Charles was a Catholic, so they later had the fortifications destroyed and left Morocco. The Spanish were able to take over quite a lot of important towns along the North African coast. To this day, the Spanish still hold on to some of their North African possessions, Melilla and Ceuta. As Europeans began to grow more in wealth, they too looked to create their own colonial empires. In particular, the Gold Coast saw a great number of Europeans arrive. But these Europeans, like in other regions, were not controlled by the governments of each country, but they were rather private trading companies. But possibly the most obscure colonial power was Courland. This was a small vassal state of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth located in modern-day Latvia. They set up a colony on the Gold Coast. Many of these countries would become distracted or indebted due to wars in Europe, and many of them would go on to sell their colonies to the Dutch or English. The French appeared as a power in the colonial game. For instance, they seized Gorée from the Dutch. This island, by the way, has a bit of a controversial history. This is because less than 5% of the 12 million slaves who crossed the Atlantic are said to have set off from the Senegambia region. The Gold Coast, for instance, sent over 10% of the slaves. The Bight of Benin, over 20%. And by far the largest number arrived from the area around Congo and Angola, with close to 40%. Most slaves were not sent to the Caribbean or the United States, but in fact, Brazil. Close to 5 million arrived in Brazil. To try and simplify the situation, the slave trade was, of course, around long before the Europeans arrived. Muslim traders had been taking slaves across the Sahara. Some African kingdoms did engage in the trade. The Oyo Empire, for instance, launched campaigns to capture slaves, which they in turn sold to buy European guns, and the cycle continued. Nearby, Dahomey also had a largely slave-based economy. They decided to create an all-female military unit named the Dahomey Amazons. These Amazons would often go on slave raids themselves. The Congolese would often try to limit the number of slaves the Portuguese exported, sometimes tried to cut off trade altogether, and they even gave refuge to runaway slaves. It mainly created a state of lawlessness, as warfare was near constant, agriculture suffered as fields were left destroyed, and many young people of working and fighting age were taken from their homes to be sent to nearby kingdoms or over to the Middle East or the Americas. Over in the west of Africa, there was an altogether new threat: jihadists. These jihads began in the 1720s and were largely launched by the Fula people. Starting with Karamoko Alpha's conquest of Futa Jalon, they destroyed many sacred animist objects belonging to the locals. But their greatest state was probably the Sokoto Caliphate. This caliphate conquered the Hausa kingdoms and ruled over the region until the very early 20th century. Meanwhile, up in the north, the Moroccans were also on the decline. When Ismail died in 1727, the country began to unravel and descend into anarchy. Their neighbors to the east, the Ottomans, were also on the decline in the 18th century. They had been losing control of North Africa ever since the beginning of the 1700s. While over in Ethiopia, there was the Age of Princes, when the country was divided between various lords and the emperor had no real power. The Kingdom of Congo, for instance, was stuck in a near-endless fight for the throne. And just at the end of the century, further east still, Napoleon invaded Egypt. This set off a huge chain reaction, which completely changed the course of African history. This is because Egypt had been governed by the Mamluks for centuries, but now they'd been defeated by Napoleon, which resulted in a power vacuum. Eventually, a man who may well have been Albanian took over. He was Muhammad Ali, and his dynasty would rule Egypt virtually independently of the Ottomans. His dynasty would change the world. They created their own empire, built the Suez Canal, and fell into debt, which brought the British into the country. So I'll look at the very beginnings of the scramble in the next episode and leave it here for now, at the end of the 18th century. The Portuguese brought maize over from the Americas, and it had spread inland by the middle of the 18th century. This led to a huge increase in population in the region. So the Zulu, along with other Bantu people, began to set up their own kingdoms, formed by Shaka Zulu. From around 1815 to 1840, the Zulus launched their wars of expansion, and this period has been called Mfakan. It is estimated that over 1 million people were killed. People fled in every direction. Mashushu. I took his Sotho people into the mountains to escape the Zulu wars. Simultaneously, the British took the Dutch colony in South Africa. What possibly angered them the most was Britain's racial policies. The British then outlawed slavery in the region in 1834. This prompted the Boers to set off north and establish their own republics. This was the Great Trek of 1836. The betrayal and massacres encouraged them to meet the Zulu at the Battle of Blood River in late 1838. In this battle, they were victorious. Probably most importantly for many African kingdoms, slavery was abolished. This ban was taken incredibly seriously by the British, as they also created the West Africa Squadron, which patrolled the seas in the area hoping to stop slave ships. This meant the kingdoms that emerged, that built their economy on the slave trade, were left economically crippled, and this weakened the continent's major powers even further. The ruler of Lagos was willing to ban slavery. To secure British support, a fleet was dispatched to Lagos. They bombarded the city and installed Akitoye on the throne. Over in London, the African Association was set up, aimed at exploring the continent further. They sent Mungo Park to Timbuktu. David Livingstone, by the way, was a Scottish missionary who, largely on his own accord, began exploring Africa in the middle of the century. He eventually disappeared in 1869, and Henry Morton Stanley was sent out to find him. They met on the shores of Lake Tanganyika. Richard Francis Burton, a peculiar explorer, tried to find the source of the Nile, but Burton also went to Mecca dressed as a Muslim. The second great event was the construction of the Suez Canal. This is why the French purchased part of what would become Djibouti several years before the Suez Canal opened. Another colonial power joined in the race, the Italians. In 1869, the newly unified Italian kingdom sent him to purchase land around Asab Bay. In 1871, the Prussians defeated the French and created the German Empire. The arrival of new European powers completely changed the status quo in Africa. Largely, the country was free from European ambitions until the outbreak of the American Civil War. The Europeans found another solution. They began to look at Egypt's growing cotton industry. Yet to encourage this trade, the Egyptians fell further into debt by building railway lines. The Egyptian wars and modernization plunged them into debt. The British were now determined to have their debts repaid, and along with the French, they sent a commission to oversee the country's finances. Many Arabs were angered by this, so they united behind Ahmed Urabi, and they rebelled in 1881. The British would later invade alone. The third major development that occurred in the 1870s was Leopold II of Belgium hiring Henry Morton Stanley to explore the Congo. Stanley was tasked with buying land in the Congo in exchange for meager gifts like bolts of cloth. The treaties with these little African tyrants are really only serious matters for the Europeans. The French also arrived nearby. Brazil secured a bit of land and created an outpost named Brazzaville, while nearby Stanley created Leopoldville. So the Berlin Conference was held in late 1884 to early 1885. 14 countries attended the conference. No Africans were invited. The conference mainly just discussed the current claims and set the boundaries between them. The conference actually began a race to sign treaties and establish control. The conference, however, did establish the idea that each country had to establish some sort of control over an area in order to claim it. Back in Sudan, a cleric named Muhammad Ahmad began gathering followers. Then he declared himself the Mahdi and launched a jihad in 1881. To oversee the withdrawal, they would send Gordon to Khartoum, but this would end in disaster as the city would be captured. The French had a brand new enemy of their own, the Wassoulou Empire, created by Samurai Touré, equipped with modern rifles, most of which were purchased from the British. In 1888, Cecil Rhodes founded the British South Africa Company, and he would send pioneer columns into Zimbabwe. Menelik signed a treaty of friendship and trade with the Italians, but the translation of this treaty caused some problems. Fortunately for the Ethiopians, they had a strange ally of sorts in the Russians. The Italians invaded. 15,000 Italians and their allies marched inland and met over 100,000 Ethiopians at the Battle of Adwa in March 1896. There, the poorly trained, outnumbered, and unprepared Italians lost to the Ethiopians, making it one of the only African countries to maintain their independence. In 1898, the British crushed the Mahdists at Omdurman. There, the British only lost around 48 men compared to 12,000 Mahdists killed. Jean-Baptiste Marchand set off from French Congo, and he made it to Fashoda in July 1898. Once there, however, he was soon joined by Kitchener. The infamous trial of Dreyfus drew attention away from Fashoda, so the French were able to peacefully resolve the crisis and withdrew, avoiding conflict with Britain. James Robert Phillips moved into Benin without permission. The Oba of Benin found out about the invasion and ambushed them. This massacre prompted a punitive expedition. The kingdom was then disbanded. The causes for the next war with the Ashanti were a little more ridiculous, as it began when Frederick Mitchell Hodgson insisted that he should be able to find and probably sit on the golden stool. The British, led by the likes of Frederick Lugard, proceeded north as well and occupied Kano. The lands were partitioned between the Germans and British. The First Boer War proved to be pretty useless against the Boer marksmen. In the Second Boer War, mainly women and children were sent to concentration camps where around 40,000 people died. Leopold of Belgium ruled the Congo using the force publique. The baskets of severed hands became the symbol of the Congo Free State. As the Germans were making enemies in Europe, they were committing atrocities in Africa by genociding the Herero people of Namibia. Trotha then declared that any Herero found within German borders would be shot. The infrastructure that was built, such as railways, was not designed to connect African regions to each other, but to make it easier to ship raw materials out of the continent. The Western-style education that missionaries and colonial governments provided also created a new generation of African leaders. These individuals learned about European ideas of democracy, liberty, and national self-determination. They began to use the language and ideas of their colonizers to argue for their own freedom. People from different ethnic groups who had never seen themselves as one were now bound together as Kenyans, Nigerians, Congolese. The shared experience of oppression began to create a basis for a new kind of unity. By the early 20th century, most of Africa was fully under European control. The final nations to fall, like Morocco, would cause tensions between the great powers in the build-up to the First World War. The struggles for independence in the 20th century did not come from nowhere. They grew directly out of the history of this period. The 4 centuries that shaped Africa also forged the will to be free.